Meghan expected criticism. She expected another cold statement from the palace, another carefully worded reminder that distance now separated her from royal life. What she did not expect was King Charles making the boundary unmistakably public. In a decision that landed with brutal finality, access she once believed remained available was revoked in full. The message was larger than paperwork. A door connected to history had just been closed, and everyone understood who had turned the key. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan read the confirmation once, then again, as if the second reading might soften what the first had made clear. The royal archives, the controlled collection where the monarchy preserves papers, correspondence, household records, photographs, and private material, had become forbidden territory. Access was never merely about research. It carried trust, proximity, and permission to enter the recorded memory of the crown. Now Charles had publicly ordered every remaining privilege linked to her royal role withdrawn, including special requests and restricted research channels. Meghan lowered the notice and looked toward the aide beside her. She asked whether Charles had personally approved the wording. The answer came, yes. Her expression changed. She pushed her chair backward, placed the notice on the table, and demanded earlier messages concerning her archival permissions. If this door had been closed deliberately, she wanted to know when the decision had begun taking shape. Charles felt no triumph when the final authorization reached him. He signed, set down the pen, and remained silent. The king believed the measure protected the institution, yet the language carried a personal cost. One phrase was especially severe: future use of historically sensitive material. Those words suggested the palace feared more than curiosity. They hinted that someone believed particular records could become dangerous outside royal control. William had already been briefed before publication. The prince did not object, and that silence mattered. Charles was not acting alone. The future king understood that certain records carried consequences beyond private embarrassment, when family memory and public controversy collided. Yet his agreement created another mystery. What had William been told that made him accept such a drastic boundary? Meghan's shock hardened into suspicion. She no longer saw only a revoked privilege. She saw a warning aimed at what she might discover. And one question now overshadowed every other thought. What exactly did the king believe she was preparing to seek inside those archives? The public announcement may have belonged to Charles, but the emotional consequences belonged to everyone whose history was suddenly trapped behind that closed door. The palace could describe the decision as procedure, but nobody at the center of it experienced it that way. Meghan saw rejection. Charles saw protection. William saw a boundary that should perhaps have been drawn years earlier. Beneath the formal language sat three very different memories of trust, family, and betrayal. That was what made the archival ban so powerful. It did not merely restrict access to documents. It forced each of them to confront what they believed the past belonged to. Meghan felt the cut because she once worked inside the royal structure, where archived material supported speeches, ceremonial preparation, patronage work, and historical research. The working royal system, the family members carrying out official duties for the crown, had once given her reasons to consult history. Now that connection was being rewritten. She told a trusted advisor the restriction felt less like security than a judgment on whether her years inside the family still counted. Charles carried a different burden. He had inherited responsibility not only for the monarchy's future, but for sensitive records tied to previous generations, including family correspondence that could reopen old wounds. The king understood those papers mattered because private history could affect relationships, public trust, and the crown's reputation. Yet he also knew how easily protection could look like punishment. Meghan discovered something that sharpened the insult. Her privileges had not vanished when she stepped away from royal duties. Limited channels had remained available, narrow but real, allowing requests to pass through review. Charles's new order eliminated even those surviving routes. She read that detail twice, and asked why a permission tolerated for years had suddenly become unacceptable. William wrestled with the answer before anyone gave it. The prince feared that private material involving Diana could become ammunition in another public war, but he knew his mother's name made every restriction personal. He wanted her memory protected, not used to justify silencing someone else. That distinction mattered to him, even if nobody outside the room could see it. Charles quietly asked an advisor whether the restriction could be narrowed enough to protect personal papers without making Meghan appear targeted. The response was cautious. Anything less might leave the channels under review open. He understood immediately. Someone inside the system believed those permissions had become a genuine risk. William stood beside Charles after the briefing and said almost nothing. When the king finally asked whether he thought the decision went too far, the future king answered with a question of his own. Why had it become necessary now? That single word, now, led directly toward the incident the palace had been trying not to discuss. Every rupture has a moment people later identify as the point of no return. In this story, it came weeks before Charles's announcement, hidden inside what first appeared to be an ordinary research request. Nothing about the initial wording sounded explosive, but the names attached to the material changed the temperature immediately. A senior archivist read the request, stopped halfway down the page, and contacted the palace. By the end of that afternoon, Charles had been told that Meghan was seeking access to records nobody expected her to request. Charles felt the warning immediately when the file reached his private briefing. Certain archival collections contain restricted correspondence, private family communications, that require special permission because they are not treated like ordinary public records. Meghan had previously shown interest in how women who married into the royal family were treated across generations, so historical research alone was not suspicious. What unsettled the king was the precision of what she wanted. Meghan had requested material touching Diana, senior courtiers, and private discussions about how married and royal women were handled during moments of crisis. She had framed the request as an attempt to understand patterns inside the institution, but Charles could not ignore the possible consequences. Those papers mattered because they connected personal pain with palace decision-making, and because anything involving Diana carried extraordinary emotional weight for William as well as for the monarchy itself. Charles turned to the most sensitive entry. The specific request concerned a sealed correspondence file catalogued around internal palace discussions following Diana's 1995 BBC interview and the effect that broadcast had on royal communications policy. That file became the trigger. The king closed the briefing folder, removed his glasses, and asked the senior archivist whether Meghan understood how sensitive the material was. The answer came without hesitation. She knew exactly what she had requested. Meghan reacted sharply when an advisor told her the application had been delayed. She argued that asking questions about history should not automatically be treated as threatening the family. To her, the delay suggested fear. To Charles, the request suggested that private records could become part of another public reckoning. Neither interpretation left much room for trust. Charles then ordered a review of every remaining route Meghan could still use. That review uncovered something nobody expected. An older administrative authorization had never been formally cancelled after she stepped away from royal duties. The forgotten permission still gave her a narrow path to submit requests normally closed to outsiders. Charles now had two choices. He could quietly shut the loophole and hope Meghan accepted it, or confront her before the restriction became public. Once the king understood the precision of her request, avoiding that confrontation was no longer possible. Charles did not begin by accusing her. Meghan did not begin by apologizing. That restraint lasted less than 5 minutes. With no cameras and no ceremonial language to soften the exchange, the king asked why she wanted the restricted correspondence. Meghan answered that history should not belong only to the people who control the institution. The sentence landed hard. Charles leaned back, studied her carefully, and realized the disagreement was no longer about one file. They were arguing over who had the right to define the royal past. Charles had arranged the private conversation before finalizing the restriction because he wanted Meghan's explanation without advisors shaping every sentence. The disputed correspondence included private household memoranda, internal written records used by royal staff to preserve decisions and discussions across previous reigns. That mattered because such papers could expose not only personal views, but the hidden reasoning behind choices that had affected generations of the family. Meghan insisted she was searching for patterns, especially in how women entering royal life had been treated when pressure turned public. Meghan felt the accusation before Charles finished speaking. He told her private family correspondence could not become material for another public dispute. She asked whether he believed that was her intention. The king did not answer quickly enough. To her, the silence said everything. She told him trust had broken long before she began asking questions, and that locking away the past would not repair what had already happened. Charles stiffened at that. He had expected disagreement, but not the rawness beneath it. The monarch told Meghan the review had uncovered several additional categories she could still request, including sensitive material connected to earlier reigns. His concern was no longer one file. It was the surviving pathway itself, a route that had remained open after her formal royal role had ended. Meghan understood the scale of the decision at once. Charles was not delaying a single application. He intended to remove the entire mechanism, allowing her to approach restricted material through privileges linked to her former position. She rose before he did. The king asked her to sit down, but she remained standing. Meghan told Charles that making the restriction public would transform an administrative decision into a declaration against her. He answered quietly that perhaps clarity was exactly what the family now required. Then came the sentence that ended any illusion of compromise. If the boundary could not be accepted privately, he would make it public. Charles had drawn the line, but enforcing it would require machinery far larger than one painful family conversation. Royal power rarely looks dramatic when it is being exercised most effectively. There was no shouting inside the offices responsible for carrying out Charles's decision. There were checklists, signatures, security classifications, and names removed from authorization systems. Yet every small administrative action carried enormous emotional force. Meghan's access was disappearing one permission at a time. And at the center of the process, Charles faced the uncomfortable truth that once the order entered the palace machinery, even he could not pretend it was merely a family disagreement. Charles understood that archival access was not controlled by a single key or one locked room. It depended on custodians, household offices, legal advisors, and record classifications. The layered permission system, deciding who could request sensitive royal material and under what conditions. The king's authority over privately controlled records meant his instruction could trigger a full administrative review. That mattered because once each permission was examined and removed, reversing the decision would become far more complicated than simply changing his mind. A senior archivist hesitated when Meghan's name appeared on the final authorization list. The official remembered her working royal years, remembered ordinary research requests, and understood that this was not simply another account being closed. She had once belonged inside the institution. Now the machinery was formally placing her outside it. The archivist paused, then completed the removal, knowing that a human relationship had just been reduced to a line in an access system. Charles felt that same weight when the final briefing reached him. He moved slowly through the categories being withdrawn until he reached records connected to Diana. The monarch stopped there. He knew those papers carried pain for William, and he knew any decision involving his late mother could reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Protection might be necessary, but using her history as justification could make the restriction feel deeply personal. William raised exactly that concern in a separate conversation. The prince asked whether stronger controls would apply to everyone seeking sensitive material about Diana, not Meghan alone. He wanted his mother's records protected, but he refused to let her memory become a weapon in another family conflict. Charles understood the distinction, even if the process had already moved beyond simple symbolism. Then the review uncovered something unexpected. One research request remained unresolved inside the system. submitted before Meghan's access was revoked. Charles read the request number, closed the folder, and asked for the subject heading. The advisor hesitated. That hesitation changed the room. Charles asked again, more firmly. Whatever remained inside that final request would determine whether the story cooled down or detonated. The announcement shocked Meghan. The first denial wounded her more. Until that moment, the revocation remained words on palace stationery and headlines repeated across television screens. Then a formal response arrived to one of her pending research requests. Access denied. Authorization withdrawn. No further review available through her former royal status. Meghan stared at the message in silence. The theoretical door had become a real wall. Whatever anger she felt toward Charles now collided with something colder. The realization that the institution had already moved on. Meghan read the formal response without speaking. Under the new order, every outstanding archival application connected to her former royal privileges had been reassessed, and requests relying on those permissions were now closed. Any future inquiry would have to follow external research channels, the ordinary process available to people outside the royal household, where sensitive family records remain restricted. That distinction mattered because it did more than deny one file. It formally placed her on the other side of an institution she had once served from within. Meghan finally turned to a confidant and admitted what hurt most. The language did not simply say no. To her, it recategorized her. She had gone from being someone with a complicated place inside the family to someone treated as an outsider with no special standing at all. She shut her laptop and sat quietly for several seconds, refusing to let anger dictate the next move. Charles learned soon afterward that the denial had reached her. The king asked an aide whether the response could have been written with more sensitivity. The answer was uncomfortable. The language reflected the restriction he had personally approved. He could regret the coldness, but he could not separate himself from its meaning. The order was no longer theoretical for him either. Then the contents of the unresolved request finally became clear. Meghan had sought internal correspondence from the period immediately after she and Harry stepped back from royal duties, including discussions about how the palace planned to respond publicly. She believed those records might show that decisions affecting her reputation were being coordinated behind closed doors. That belief explained why the file mattered so deeply, and why Charles had viewed the request as so dangerous. Meghan resisted the obvious response. She told her advisor not to release a statement, not yet. Instead, she asked for something nobody expected, a private conversation with William. For the first time since Charles's order became public, Meghan stopped fighting the institution and turned toward the one person who might understand why those records felt so personal. No secretaries sat between them. No palace statement waited to translate what either person meant. Meghan and William entered the conversation, carrying years of frustration, suspicion, grief, and unfinished arguments. Yet the first surprise was how quietly it began. She did not ask him to overturn Charles's decision. He did not demand that she stop questioning the past. Instead, Meghan asked whether William truly believed she wanted the archives simply to damage the monarchy. His answer changed the emotional direction of the entire conflict. William had agreed to speak because the disputed records touched two wounds he could not treat as ordinary paperwork: Meghan's departure and Diana's legacy. The prince understood that his mother's private history had spent decades becoming public argument. Meghan, meanwhile, made one thing clear immediately. She no longer expected her archival access to be restored. That admission shifted the conversation away from permissions and towards something harder to answer: whether her motives had ever been judged fairly. William chose his words carefully. He told Meghan that his deepest fear was not curiosity, but what happened when private family papers became weapons in public battles. He had watched Diana's pain repeated, debated, interpreted, and used by people who never knew her. The future king did not want another generation feeding on the same wounds. Meghan heard something she had not expected. His resistance was not driven entirely by suspicion. Part of it came from grief. Meghan answered with a fear of her own. She told William that when history remained controlled only by the palace, powerful people could decide which wounds were preserved and which quietly disappeared. To her, restricted records were not simply secrets, they were possible answers. The prince did not agree, but he understood why the request had become personal. William then shared something through their private conversation that Meghan had not known. Charles's final order had gone further than he originally supported. He wanted sensitive personal records protected, especially those involving Diana, but he had never asked for every surviving privilege connected to Meghan to be cancelled. That distinction surprised her. Meghan responded with her own revelation. She had no intention of launching a legal challenge. She wanted William to understand why she had sought the records before deciding how she would respond publicly. William paused before leaving. He told Meghan that protecting Diana's papers did not require pretending her questions were meaningless. She answered quietly that it was the first time anyone inside the family had made that distinction. Their private understanding could not undo Charles's order, but it would change how the monarchy defended it when the outside world erupted. Charles does not reverse the order. Meghan does not challenge it. William does not pretend the decision caused no damage. That is how the conflict finally ends. Not with victory, apology, or dramatic reconciliation, but with three people accepting a boundary none of them entirely likes. The royal archives remain closed to Meghan under her former privileges. The king keeps the protection he believes history requires. Meghan keeps the right to disagree with what that protection represents. And William becomes the unlikely bridge between those truths. Charles confirms privately that the revocation is permanent. Meghan may still consult public collections through normal research procedures, but no special royal authorization will return. The royal archives, the monarchy's controlled collection of historic papers and sensitive family records, will remain partly closed where private material is concerned. The palace is not deleting her from history. It is separating her documented place in royal life from privileged access to protected memory. Charles later admits to William that he regrets making the decision painful, but he does not regret drawing the boundary. The king knows the announcement wounded Meghan, yet he believes family connection cannot override responsibility for restricted records. The prince listens without defending the process. He understands that protection can be necessary while still causing damage. Meghan reaches her own decision quietly. She will not launch a legal challenge or organize a media campaign to regain access. She places the final palace correspondence into a folder and closes it without answering. For her, that gesture becomes control. She cannot decide what the monarchy releases, but she can refuse to let sealed documents decide whether her experiences were real. William's intervention changes part of the outcome. He supports the restriction, but rejects language portraying Meghan as dangerous or untrustworthy. That distinction prevents the dispute from becoming an attack on her character. It gives Charles a way to defend the archives without deepening the rupture. Charles receives confirmation at Windsor that no challenge will follow, and nods. William hears the same news and understands the escalation is over. Meghan keeps her voice. The king keeps the boundary. The future king keeps disagreement from becoming condemnation. Nobody receives everything they wanted, but the verdict is clear. Meghan remains part of royal history without privileged authority over its protected records. Charles establishes a permanent institutional line. William proves that boundaries do not require personal destruction. The door remains closed, the decision remains permanent, and everyone involved finally chooses to walk away rather than force it open. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.